Great, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, like you said, it's a little earlier here. I think I got up at 5 in the morning, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you for joining me. Um, I'll switch to my slide deck and then we can just get started. I'm going to assume that everyone can see this now. My talk isn't necessarily about design. It isn't really about pixel pushing. It isn't really about interfaces. It's more of I guess, a bit of a taboo topic to some. I want to talk about failure today. And when I say failure, I mean personal failure as well as professional failure at my team level. And I'll walk you through that. But before I do so, I want to take a step back. In fact, a whole lot of steps back to the year 1996. Now, why 1996, you might be wondering? The reason for this is that 1996 was, in fact, one of the best years in the history of mankind, I would argue, for various reasons. I'll skip through a few of them. One of them is that the Backstreet Boys launched their debut album and made an undeniable mark on the world. I bet you there is probably no one on this conference who has not heard the Backstreet Boys. It sparked a lifelong interest in boy bands for myself. Secondly, Super Mario 64 was a launch title for the Nintendo 64, which came out in 1996. So a lifelong passion for gaming, a hobby, and just everything that went right in my life probably had to do with gaming, and it started right here. And lastly, but for the purpose of this talk, most importantly, in 1996, I was 4 years old. Now, this picture isn't me. I just Googled cute toddler boy, 4 years old, and I'm probably on some FBI watch list right now. But the point here is in 1996, I was 4 years old. Now, I grew up in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, when you're 4 years old, you start going to elementary school. I don't know if that's quite the same in South Africa, but in the Netherlands, that's at 4 years old. And in this period, right when you get to your first class, they ask you one of the most important questions in your entire life, and you're just expected to answer that on the spot. In the Netherlands, when you go to elementary school, they ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which is a very important question, which is probably something that even into your early 20s or some people their late 30s, they might not actually be able to answer what they want to be when they grow up. But if you were as a kid, you probably had an answer at the ready. You've seen some TV shows, you've heard people talk about it, you've seen some cool stuff on the streets. You probably picked something really cool. You probably picked a profession like, oh, I want to be a fireman because, who doesn't want to be a fireman? Or I want to be an astronaut, exploring the outer reaches of space. You've seen some sci-fi movies. That's super cool. Or for the humanitarians amongst us, you might have said at that point, oh, I want to be a doctor. I want to help people. I want to cure people. That's what I want to do. That wasn't me. I wasn't a cool kid back then. I'm probably not a cool kid right now. My hopes and dreams were a little different. Coincidentally, that's also a great name for a pair of racehorses, hopes and dreams. But my hopes and dreams look a little bit like this. Now, you're probably looking at that picture and you're like, okay, I get it. Paul wanted to be a race jockey, get on that horse, win races. Nope, I did not. Now, there's only so many things in that picture. And now you're probably thinking to yourself, oh, if not the jockey, then what else? Well, I want it to be the racehorse. I did not get the fact that humans and horses were in fact entirely different species and that I couldn't become a racehorse, but that's what I wanted to be. In elementary school, if you asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have told you I want to be a racehorse. Now, for a little kid, I had a lot of good reasons for this. One, racehorses are fast. It's undeniable. A racehorse's entire point of existence is to be fast. And I was a slow little fat kid, and all I wanted to do was be fast. Racehorses were focused. They had one goal, and that is to win that race, to be the first horse to cross that line. I wanted that laser focus. And horses are incredibly determined to get across that line first. These were all of the reasons why I wanted to be a racehorse. Now, fast forwarding a little bit to the year 2017. At this point, still a human, not a racehorse. I had come to the realization that I probably couldn't transcend the bounds of my human existence and somehow become a horse. And I was living in Helsinki in Finland. My wife is Finnish, which is how I ended up there in the first place. Um, and it's a beautiful country. And at this point in time, I was working in advertising. I was working at an ad tech company out in Helsinki, and we were working with some of the biggest customers, some of the biggest tech companies on the planet. Think Ubers, Airbnbs, etc. We were working with them, helping them improve the efficiency of their advertising campaigns. And what was happening during this time is that we saw a lot of negative feedback coming from these companies that we really wanted to make sure we're enjoying our product and we're happy with our product. And what we decided to do was we needed to get back to the basics, talk to these customers, and figure out what they actually wanted. Because we had been developing a feature roadmap on the basis of we guess this is what people want, or just from logical abstraction, we figured what people wanted. But we realized that might not actually be what they want. So why not just go and ask them? So what we did was we set up a large scale research project that took us all across the globe. We were based in Helsinki. We flew to Singapore, flew to South Africa, flew to New York, San Francisco, etc. And I spent a lot of time on the road during this time. In fact, I took over 36 flights a year during the span of 2 years. I spent 150 days on average per year on the road interviewing customers. And we conducted over 200 interviews over this time span. That is a lot of time to spend on the road. I wouldn't recommend it. My wife was stuck at home and she still hates me for it. But that's what we did. We talked, as I mentioned, to some of the biggest customers we had, to Ubers, Airbnbs, HelloFresh, tech companies that everyone on the planet is guaranteed to know. And once we started talking to them, we started to get a better understanding of what they actually wanted. We started to get an understanding of what they, as the biggest advertisers, were looking for. They were leagues above most of our customers in their degree of advancement. And their demands were a lot bigger and a lot more complex than some of our other customers. So what we really wanted to do was attentively listen to what they were saying and then figure out how that would impact feature development. So when they said, Paul, I would like a feature that does X, Y, Z, I would be like, okay, I'll take that back to my team and we'll get right on it. In fact, I wanted to do that as fast as possible. If they said on Monday, I want that feature, I'd be like, okay, Monday, 2 weeks from now, I will get it back to you. And that became my sole focus. I was laser focused to get that done. I was determined to get that feature across the finish line. And in fact, without really realizing it, I had reached my childhood dream and aspiration of becoming a racehorse. Now, to give you an example of what that looked like, I have a few product examples of how this kind of came to be and what that meant for the product. An example of this is we spoke to one of our bigger customers and they said, I wish I could query for active campaigns, meaning they wish they could query for a campaign that was currently running, was spending money, and was gathering data. Now, looking at that sentence, and this is almost verbatim what they said at that point, we thought, okay, query. I know what query means. That's like SQL. It's a querying language. You want to query our database. So what we did was we presented them with an interface that allowed them to enter an SQL-like abstraction that filtered for active campaigns, campaigns that were spending more than $0 and had a status of currently active. Now, if you're looking at this and you're entirely confused, so are most people. Most people thought, what is this? Is that what I asked for? I asked if I could query for campaigns and you present me with some abstraction of a code layer? No, that's not what they really wanted. Because while they were saying, I wish I could query for active campaigns, what they were saying was, I wish I could filter, which is much more human understandable language and also presents itself in a much more simple and feasible feature. So what we ended up doing was we ended up scrapping that abstraction layer and just coming up with a series of dropdowns. You select whatever parameter you're looking for, the operator, and then you're good to go. It's much more readable. It's much more simple. You don't need an understanding of database querying languages. And we almost literally face palmed when we realized that we had spent months working with these customers trying to figure out what they really wanted, and then just took verbatim what they were saying rather than trying to interpret that, trying to conceptualize what they actually wanted. Another example of this is we had toggles in our product. In fact, we had a lot of different toggles. Toggles that basically said on or off, and then had a few words next to it that described the title of that feature. An example of this is we had a feature that was called Predictive Budget Allocation. And that's it. It was in the product exactly like this, just a toggle and the title of that feature. Now, to you, it probably doesn't mean anything at this point. To our customers, it also didn't mean anything. They could guess what this feature would do, but they didn't really know because there was no description otherwise. In fact, the only thing that was really there was a tiny little question mark tooltip that directed them to our external documentation. And deep in this documentation, you would find an article for predictive budget allocation. And the initial paragraph goes a little bit like this. Now, you don't need to read the entire thing. The important parts I've highlighted here are the Bayesian multi-armed bandit method and Bayesian posterior estimation, which, again, what does that even mean? What on earth is a Bayesian multi-armed bandit, and how does he estimate my posterior? So what we realized was there shouldn't be a reason for customers to have to guess what a feature does or dig deep into very technically dense documentation. All they needed was a simple line that described what that feature did. In this case, predictive budget allocation moves budget between assets or campaigns based on their performance. It's simple as that. And just by adding that single line, we increase feature adoption 4 times over. We just didn't realize that we were being so obtuse with what we were doing because our biggest customers were using it. So obviously, if the bigger customers are using it, it will somehow trickle down on the others. In fact, if you imagine our user base as this sphere, we thought, okay, by doing what Uber wants, surely we're doing what everyone else wants as well, because Uber is just a little ahead of the pack. But what we were doing was we took this little sliver, the 1%, our biggest customers. These were the ones we interviewed. These were the ones we cared about. And we thought that would apply to the entire user base, but it didn't. What that 1% of most technologically advanced customers wanted was not, in fact, what the rest wanted. Maybe at some point in the future, maybe not. The fact of the matter is that we were designing something that's so dense and so complicated that we were losing customers left and right. We become fixated on this very small portion of our user base, this 1%. We were stubborn because we said, okay, whatever works for them works for others. And it was a sort of single-minded determination. Whatever Uber says, whatever Airbnb says, whatever HelloFresh says, that's what we're going to do. That dictated our entire feature roadmap, which was one of our biggest failures to date. We saw churn rates go up incredibly. We saw the retention rate drop. In fact, one of the biggest signifiers of how much we were failing to adequately deliver features that the majority of our user base wanted was that when I started out at this company, we had a 2-week free trial period. You create an account, didn't have to pay anything. After 14 days, you would start paying for it. And customers would just jump in, start using the platform, testing it on their campaigns, and things would go well. But the product had become so complicated and so hard to understand that a year into my stay at the company, we replaced that 2-week free trial period with 4 weeks of guided onboarding, which literally meant you had a customer success manager that was assigned to you as a customer and almost literally held your hand for 2 weeks or 2 to 4 weeks for you to figure out what the product meant. They were available 24/7. Some of them I know got up in the middle of the night to answer a phone call from a customer just to explain what something like predictive budget allocation actually does, or what multi-armed Bayesian bandits whatnots are. Now, you probably think, okay, the company just went kaboom. That company imploded on its own complexity. It didn't. I'm sorry to spoil that. It didn't. Because we realized that while we were failing to understand what our user base wanted by only listening to the 1%, we also realized that was our point of failure. So what we did was we tried to increase our exposure to that entire sphere that is our user base. We realized this failure and we started making up for it. One of the things we started doing was exit interviews. Much like if you were to leave a company, someone from HR would step up. They would ask you a series of questions. What could we have done to keep you at this company? What could we have done better? How can we learn from what we did with you and apply that to the next person to make sure they stay for longer? We did the same with our customers. As soon as they left the platform, we reached out and we asked, like, what could we have done to keep you here? Or even better, what can we do to get you back? So we started listening to almost every single customer that left the platform, just to increase that exposure. We started surveying our customers, and we were already doing this. We just weren't actually listening to those surveys. What we did was we had a net promoter score that indicated how happy customers were with the product and how likely they were to be recommending the platform to coworkers, friends, etc. And we started looking at the lower end of that tier, customers that were unhappy, trying to figure out why they were unhappy. Why wouldn't they recommend the product to another person? And lastly, the company adopted a mantra that I think is incredibly powerful, and I still try to exercise this at Shopify today, which is everyone does support. That meant that everyone from the chief executive officer down to myself as a product designer was doing support. We had a intercom integration, a live chat integration into our tool that allowed customers to directly reach out from whatever page they were on and start asking questions. And for 4 hours every single week, I would jump into the support room and do support, because this was essentially the front line where we could directly interact with a customer base and directly understand what their problems were at that specific point in time. There was no part of our effort to increase exposure that was as impactful as this is, just to get an understanding of what was really happening. Now, all of these methods to increase exposure stem from the fact that we realized what our failure was. We admitted that failure doesn't necessarily mean defeat. I mean, the Apollo program didn't land on the moon until number 13. That doesn't mean NASA decided to just pack their bags and go home, but they realized that they were making failures. They admitted to that, and then they started correcting that. They used the information that they had from their previous failures to improve the future. And if there's two things that I would like you to take away from this, first of all, own your failures. It's what I'm doing right now. I'm opening up about the ways that we failed to you. I'm telling you how things went wrong, how things went a little awry, but we corrected that. When I interviewed at Shopify, I opened up about these failures. I said the company I worked at isn't perfect. The work I was doing isn't perfect. But I learned from that, and I'm hoping to do better at this company knowing what I know now. Which brings me to the second point, that knowing what not to do is, in my opinion, more important than knowing what to do. Anyone can give you a handbook that says, do this, go there, do that. But once you go slightly off the path, that handbook doesn't really do anything anymore. That set of instructions doesn't help. Your experience in failure, your experience in knowing what not to do will come in much more handy at that point. And knowing what not to do was what got me here in the first place. That's my talk about failure. Thank you for listening. You can reach out to me on Twitter if you want to do so at Paul Van Oijen. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for that talk. When you started and you said that it's a bit taboo, I mean, it's something that I wish more people would be speaking about, the taboo stuff. Because I think through speaking about the taboo stuff, we get to understand, and essentially people don't speak about it because there's this perception, that we shouldn't be speaking about failures, we shouldn't be speaking about bad UX or lessons learned or dark patterns and what we should and shouldn't be doing. I mean, thank you so much for showcasing, the challenges that you had and how you managed it. So we've got two questions. The first question is from Lizette. I've noticed more and more that clients are starting to use product designer and UX designer interchangeably. What, in your mind, is the difference?
That's a very good question. Recently at Shopify, we also changed to product designer. It used to be called UX designer. The discipline as a whole is still called UX. So we have UX researchers because their entire purpose is to research the user experience. But product designer to me kind of unites the aspects of a UI designer and a UX designer. So it is a designer that has to understand the whole spectrum of what makes up the user experience, both the interface as well as the experience of using that interface. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that, Paul. The next question we've got from Carter. How did you create a safe space for discussing failures with everyone in the team?
That's a fair point. I simply started speaking up about my own failures to encourage people to do so themselves. I still do so at my current position. When things are suggested, like we should try this method or that method, I will open up about ways that I might have experimented with that in the past and how that might have gone wrong. Because knowing how things might go wrong, as I said, will tell you how to correct, how to not make those same mistakes in the future. So just opening up about your own failures will likely encourage others to do so as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Paul. So the next question we've got from Magdalene. Did working in support feel as useful as doing user research or usability testing?
It felt more useful. As much as user testing or usability testing can tell you about the validity of your product, you can't really estimate what the real world impact of that would be. Because every type of testing you're likely going to be doing is in a simulated environment. You dictate what the rules are, you dictate what the boundaries are. Whereas when you start doing support, you get people doing their 9-to-5 job, using your tool for their work, using your tool for whatever it is that they use it for, and in real life scenarios, ones that you haven't set up and ones that you don't know the rules of. So it is, in my opinion, much more beneficial to do support than it would be to do usability testing.
Awesome, thank you. I hope that answers the question, Magdalene. And then we've got two more questions. So the next question is from James. How do you ensure you fail early and fail fast?
That's a tough one. I try to go as broad as possible when I start working on something. So I churn out as many possible iterations of a concept that I can, whether that's on paper, on a whiteboard, whether it's a wireframe in Figma. I try to go as broad as possible and then start shipping it out in usable prototypes to our merchants. So I start trying to expose and recruit. I start recruiting merchants and start exposing them to these various prototypes as fast as I possibly can, so that we start weeding out the ones that don't work, find the ones that do work or even just kind of work, and then keep iterating on that. The key part is just that constant iteration, constantly trying to figure out what is or isn't working.
I mean, maybe just to ask another question on top of that. Is it that you're working in cycles and sprints and all of that, or are you time boxing, to manage that? Because if you're failing, if you're trying to understand, when, how, and so on, time does become a factor. So how do you manage that?
That's fair. We usually work in 2-week sprint cycles, but when we start designing for an entirely new feature, we tend to do a Google design sprint, just a full week of getting the entire team together to conceptualize a solution to a problem or a set of solutions, because that also allows you to test out your concepts internally, and it gets the entire team in the same frame of mind.
Okay.
So it basically limits your time on trying to think what your solutions could be, so you don't spend weeks on trying to figure out which direction you're going to go in.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers the question, James. And then the last question from Darsha, I'm just reading it, and I'm just going to change the wording slightly, but the crux of it is, for junior UX designers at Shopify or an internship, what is the expectation from them in relation to skill? So what do you expect them to do? What would they be doing?
I expect them to be capable interface designers. I expect them to be capable UI designers. I don't expect them to have as good of an understanding of the experience part of it as more senior designers would. The more senior designers, they're familiar with the methods, they're familiar with the concepts that they're working with, and they're also familiar with stakeholder management that comes at a higher level. As a junior designer, if you are a capable interface designer, and you have some understanding of how the experience is put to the test, that's fantastic. But I don't expect you to be able to have strategic conversations with higher level stakeholders. That will come later in your career.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope that answers the question, Darsha. There aren't any more questions, but thank you so much for that, Paul. I think it's been an awesome talk, and
Thank you
an
for
awesome
having
talk to end of the conference with. I just want to invite Theo to the screen as we're speaking. But I think it's been an awesome talk. I think, like I said a few seconds ago, I'm passionate about understanding and trying to understand, where the pitfalls are, and speaking about failure is a great thing that too few of us are speaking about.
Yeah.
I hope more and more would be speaking about it. But thank you so much. I'm just inviting Theo to step up as well as we close the conference. I just want to take a minute or two just to check if there aren't any other questions from anybody else.
Sure thing.